Hello, I'm Charles from Charles in Photography. This beautiful time-lapse that you're watching of the full moon rising behind the Shorncliffe Jetty was taken last Friday night, the 8th of May, from the Sandgate foreshore. This was one of my pet projects this year. I had to make sure that everything lined up to achieve my goal. And what did I have to have lined up? I needed a low tide, I needed no clouds in the sky, I needed the moon to rise just after sunset, and I also needed very little wind so that all this was possible. This video will show you how I actually achieved my goal. We start off, I was using my Nikon D7500 with the Nikon 200-500 f5.6 lens, and I was also using a timer remote because I didn't want to be touching the camera while I was doing it. Also, because I was going to be taking around 550 to 600 images. You can't just keep pressing the button. You've got to use an interval meter. I had to plan where I had to be on the night. I used an app called TPE, which is the Photographer's Ephesus, on my computer to see where the moon was going to rise. Now, most people think that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, as does the moon. But it's a fallacy. The moon and the sun track around between southeast and northeast in the southern hemisphere here, and especially in Brisbane. So depending on the time of the year you are, the moon could be rising anywhere from southeast to northeast. I had to make sure that I was in a location where the moon was going to rise above the horizon behind the gazebo on the Shorncliffe Jetty. Last year I was here in September and I was actually much closer to the jetty. I was only about 300 odd meters from the jetty to get the full moon rising above the Shorncliffe Jetty. Today, well, last Friday night, I actually had to be close to 1 kilometer away from the jetty to get this time lapse. And as you can see here in the other video that I'm actually recording at the same time, you can actually see how far I am. With TPE, the Photographer's Ephesus, I actually kept moving the marker along the foreshore so that when the moon just rose above the horizon, it was going to be in line with the gazebo. And you can see a couple of screenshots here how I actually did this. I just kept moving the marker, and this is where it told me to be. Now, I had to be about 15 meters from the foreshore on this like concrete pipe here. And this is why I had to be low tide, because I knew I had to have everything correct. Then, when I came out here, I actually used photo pills so that I actually knew exactly where I was going to be, because TPE is good to tell me where I'm going to be. But once I'm here, I had to put photo pills on my other phone here and line it up so that I knew exactly where I had to be on this concrete wall. Because it was a time lapse, I couldn't wait until the moon rose above the horizon. This is why it was so crucial that I used photo pills to see where the moon was going to rise. And I just kept moving myself along this little concrete wall until I found the exact location I had to be. So these two apps were crucial for me to get this time-lapse perfect. If you're ever going to try something like this, you've really got to rely on your apps, because when I started shooting, I had to start around 3 to 4 minutes before the moon rose. So once the moon rose, if I was in the wrong place, it would have been like tough luck. I couldn't just move it. Well, I could, but it just wouldn't be right, because you would actually see that on the video, the jetty had moved. I really had to trust these apps that I was in the right place. Once the moon started rising, I actually looked through my little viewfinder here, and I can tell you there was just a sense of relief and also like satisfaction that all my planning had actually worked. I was in the right place at the right time, and the moon came up just to the right of the gazebo, which is what I planned, so that as the moon rose, because the moon doesn't rise vertically, it rises on an angle. So as the moon rose, it actually rose behind the gazebo towards the east. It was just such a good feeling. Now, setting up the camera. This is the very important thing. When you're doing a time-lapse, especially with so heavy gear and a very heavy lens like this lens weighs in at around 2 kilos. So you've got to make sure you don't have any sort of vibration. So I was using my very heavy tripod. It's around 2 kilos. You can see I am so low to the ground here. This is as low as this tripod can go. This is a Manfrotto 055 XP Pro. It's a couple of years old now, but it is very sturdy. It's not carbon fiber, it's the old aluminium, so it's a heavy tripod to use. And this is the tripod that I use for all my Astro, my Milky Way time lapses and all that, because I know if I put my camera on here, no matter how much wind is around, it ain't going to move. So it was as low as it could go. Now, I put all my gear on here, and with the timer, just so that the timer didn't sort of strain on the camera here, I've actually got a small rubber band, and it was actually just connected to the foot of the lens so that there was very little movement you can see here. When we're photographing the full moon in the sky, it is quite bright, so we can actually use a very fast shutter speed. But at 6 o'clock last Friday night, it was just on twilight, like it was at the end of twilight, so it was actually fairly dark. Now, as the moon was going to rise, I knew the moon was going to get much brighter, but the whole process I knew was only going to take me about 10 minutes. I couldn't rely on the brightness of the moon to actually start with my settings at the start, or else everything would be too dark. So I lined up. I didn't want the gazebo in the center of the frame. I lined up so that it was just to the right of the center. I didn't want too low of a shutter speed. And the settings that I ended up using, I was at 340 mils, 1/13 of a second, and the ISO was 640. I could have had a faster shutter speed of, let's say, 1/30th or 1/40th of a second, but this would have meant increasing my ISO to, let's say, ISO 1000 or even ISO 1200. And I didn't want this because we're so far away that the further away you are from an object, especially at night, you're going to lose a little bit of clarity. So with a higher ISO would have brought a little bit of noise. I didn't want that. So I settled on 1/13 of a second. I looked at the photos and I go, yep, I'm satisfied with that. That as the moon rose above the horizon, and it was going to get brighter very quickly. But I knew that when I was going to edit this time lapse in Lightroom CC and using LRT time lapse together, that I was actually going to be able to control the brightness of the moon. So I had to make sure that the settings at the start were correct. I could control the extra brightness as the moon rose in post-processing, but I didn't want too much of a darker image at the start. So I had everything set up. Now, I didn't want to be taking one photo after the other. This time lapse was actually rendered at 24 frames a second, which means for every second of video that you saw, there was 24 photos in there. So I'd set the timer to shoot every 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds, I took a photo. Now I knew that I was going to be wasting photos because I started much earlier and I actually finished a little bit later. But that's all right. I'd rather waste, let's say, 50 to 100 frames than not starting early enough and finishing too early. So when you're doing a time lapse like this, plan to and understand that you're going to be wasting frames, but it's digital. If your project finished up being a great time lapse at the end, it was all worth it. It doesn't matter if I say, well, I shot an extra 200 frames. Big deal. I still ended up with the project that I wanted and something that everybody will appreciate watching. And this is your goal. You want something that people can watch it and go, wow, this is so beautiful. So the extra frames, isn't a big deal. What you have to make sure is all your gear is stable. Now on the lens, I actually turned VR off because it's on a stable tripod and I didn't need the VR to click in and out while it's all taking photos. The metering was actually set to center weighted because I was actually metering on the gazebo. Now at night time, although I'm saying that I used metering center weighted, that just helped me get a gauge of the exposure. But whether you use spot, center weighted or matrix metering at night time isn't a big deal because you're shooting in manual mode. That really doesn't matter because all you're doing is looking at your histogram, and I also look at the highlights to make sure that the highlights aren't too blown out. Now, the white balance, I actually used manual white balance set to around 3,800 kelvins. Now, if your camera cannot use manual white balance, now the ideal preset to use would be fluoro. This will make it slightly cooler than the sunny mode, but a little bit warmer than incandescent or tungsten, because incandescent or tungsten will be very blue. Now with white balance, although I said that I was using manual white balance at 3,800 and the white balance, if you set it in preset to use it at fluoro, this is only important if you're shooting it in JPEG. And really, if we're shooting these sorts of time lapses, you want to be shooting in RAW because this gives you so much extra editing power in Lightroom and in LRT time-lapse to get exactly what you want. Now when you're seeing something on the back of the screen here, this is where your presets come in, and this is where, like, I set my white balance to 3,800 so I can see what the photo looks like. And I am a firm believer of what I see is what I get. So this is why I really like setting everything in the camera perfectly. I like setting my white balance so I can actually see what it's going to look like when the photo is edited. Now when I get home, if 3,800 isn't quite right, I can tinker with it. I can make it a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer. That's no big deal. But if you're shooting in JPEG, white balance is something that is just about locked in. You can increase the brightness and all that a little bit on a JPEG photo, but white balance is something that is very hard, and you'll find the colors will shift very quickly. So just a reminder, if you're shooting in JPEG, you have to make sure that your white balance is just about spot on. So I had everything ready to go, and the moon, they said, was going to rise just after 6 o'clock. So I started my time lapse, I think it was about 6:05. Now it wasn't until about 6:10 that the moon actually rose above the horizon here, because the earth is curved, so it just took a bit. And as the moon came up, I could just start seeing that faint glow on the horizon. The shutter was just going click, click every seconds, and I looked up and I did a little happy dance. I was just so happy. Then I had to wait until the moon was actually quite high on the horizon. And to work this out, I actually looked through the viewfinder until the moon disappeared. But understand, when we're shooting stuff like this, we're actually shooting in a 6:4 photo. And when we're rendering the movie, we're actually rendering the movie in widescreen, which is 16:9. So the ratio, instead of 6:4, is actually 16:9, which gives you, like a widescreen TV, a rectangle. So I knew that the start and the end was going to be cut out, but that was fine. Like I said, don't mind wasting it, because the reason that I like doing it this way is that when I go home and when I start editing, it gives me room to move exactly where I want the 16:9 frame to be in my photo. If you've actually sort of restricted yourself in the amount of photos you take, you're not going to have much room to move. So when the moon was above the frame and it was all finished, I shut the camera off, inverted the camera so I was actually shooting in portrait, and I took a couple of photos of the moon slightly higher than the jetty, and that was it. Now, this is all that needed to be done here. And the main thing when we're shooting time lapses like that is not to wait until you're here on the night to decide what you're going to do. It's prior preparation. You're planning This is the most important part. Coming here, lining it up is important, but not as important as making sure that your homework is done. If you don't do your homework, if you don't do your research, how are you going to know exactly where you're going to have to be? I turned up here, it was 5:45, so I knew I had about 15 minutes to set up. But if I turned up and I was at the start of the boardwalk down here, only a couple of 100 metres from the Shorncliffe Jetty, I would have had very little time to get down here, and I would have probably been rushing. So this is why I say, if you're going to shoot something like this and you've never done it, you've never been here, then come during the day, scout out the location, see, okay, well, this is what it looks like during the day, then go home and download this app, the TPE. On a computer, it's free. If you put it on your phone, you're going to have to pay for it. Do all your planning and make sure that everything is spot on. Now, the next video in this series, I'm going to show you how I actually edited this time-lapse in conjunction with LRT time-lapse and Lightroom CC. And because it was such a complicated time-lapse, what I'm going to do is walk you through all my editing that I did. It actually took me over 3 hours to actually edit this time-lapse, because the start of the time-lapse was fairly easy to render. Now, as the moon got brighter, I had to make sure that I controlled the brightness of the moon, and this is the part that took me the longest. I hope this tutorial has helped you, and if you want to see how I actually edited, then watch the second video that will be in the description at the end of this tutorial. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel down here, and I'll see you next time. This is Charles for Charles in Photography. Bye for now.